Feeling your feelings is one of the biggest things that you can do to resist systems of oppression. Because if you really felt the ways that these systems have impacted you, your parents, your grandparents, your lineage, this planet as a whole, you would be out there resisting in the streets. Why is this such a threat to systems of oppression? Keep listening for more. Before we get into it, my name is Carolyn Collado, and welcome to Recovery for the Revolution, where we decondition, decolonize, and get ready for the revolution through recovery as a resistance practice. Capitalism does everything that it can to keep us from feeling the impacts of systems of oppression. Capitalism crunches our time to where we do not have any time or space to feel. So many of us come from lineages where our parents, our grandparents, our great grandparents, all they have ever known has been hustle and survival. That goes hand in hand with colonization, right? Because colonization extracted resources from so many places all over the world, the global south, thinking about Ireland in this moment, and Ireland as like the OG colony where British colonization was like inspired and then enacted all over the world. So many of us come from places where resources were extracted, or if you are of a settler lineage, you came to this paradigm and were told that in order to survive, you had to be hustling, you had to extract resources, and you had to exploit other people in order to survive, in order to be comfortable, in order to amass wealth. So all of us have been on, honestly, this pyramid scheme of capitalism, of grinding it out in order to live, in order to keep a roof over our head, in order to keep food in our bellies, clothes on our back, in order to survive these systems. For some of us, if in our ancestors, in our lineage, if we fail to do that, there would be a lot of consequences. We think about slavery and we think about, shout out to Joy DeGroy's post-traumatic slave syndrome, shout out to Resmaa Menakem's My Grandmother's Hands. Both of those books talk about the violence of slavery and the ways that that has carried out, lived in our bodies, and also has been replicated in generation after generation. Shout out to The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Slavery was a system that reinforced through violence, like the constant need for production, right? If you did not produce, you would face physical violence and death. I think about slavery in the Caribbean, which was particularly brutal and particularly disposing of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, where, we think about the sugar industry, which is called the white gold, right? So many industries built their wealth, like Citibank, like Yale University, from the extraction of labor in the Caribbean. And it was brutal. If your hand, if your arm, if your limb got caught in the machine that was like producing the sugar, they wouldn't stop the machine. They would cut it off. Slavery in the Caribbean was particularly known to have like high turnover rate. There were so many of us who were brought to the Caribbean, who were brought to South America, thinking about Brazil, that also has a really big like sugar industry production. So many of us who were brought to those nations, and this was the norm, right? Like a high turnover rate, an industry that was so big on, we don't stop production. What we do is dispose of you. And I think about the impact of that on so many of us who are Afro-descended, who are Black, thinking about just that notion, that internalization, that we can never stop. Thinking outside the Caribbean, thinking about like torture, the ways that torture was enacted to encourage production, like the fear of violence as a way to encourage production. That is what we inherit, and those norms still continue as part of the capitalist system. So when you have all of that, you have like the ever present pressure to produce. And you know that that's even worse or even more intense if you are Black, if you are Indigenous, if you are an immigrant. Like the norms of production are so high because there's white supremacy. There's white supremacy. And thinking about immigrant labor, I'm thinking about like farmers, right? I saw a post yesterday that was marking the graves of farmers who have been lost to high amounts of heat that are happening right now in California as I'm recording this. There is a disposability that still is happening in this system. Thinking about slave labor that is happening in prisons, right? And the ways that we keep incarcerating people to keep producing this disposable labor. Like it's still so high. And for all of us who are not in those positions, the biggest thing that we try to do is to not be there, right? This is a country that just made homelessness, being unhoused, it made it illegal. And yet, so many of us are struggling to pay our bills. So many of us are struggling to survive. So, yeah, you better get cranking. You better get grinding. You better do everything you can to produce. It's such an intense pressure. And yet I'm telling you in this podcast that feeling all of this is one of the biggest ways that we can resist these systems, and feeling all of the unprocessed trauma that has been alive in our lineages is one of the big ways that we can resist. Why is that so important? Everything that I just talked a bit about slavery, right? But also thinking about the genocides that have been experienced, the genocides that were enacted to create the conditions for colonization. You know, I come from the so-called Dominican Republic, and that was like one of the first major sites of indigenous genocide. It was like the first settled country. So all of the indigenous genocide that made that possible in the Dominican Republic, thinking about the US empire and how much indigenous genocide was enacted here to create the conditions where now it's like here a nation full of settlers, right? Full of people who do not come from here and who are like extracting from the land and the resources here to create this country and to keep living in these paradigms that we hate, right? Like living in this way of like working to live is horrifying. Like we could have really lived in the ways before colonization of where we had community care. We had relationship to nature that like we were provided for in terms of food. We didn't have to work so long to cultivate our ability to live. We had spaciousness to feel and to be. But would you even know that if you didn't have like the time to listen to this podcast, or before this podcast, maybe you had heard that from like a teacher or somebody on the internet talking about this? Capitalism does not want us, and other systems of oppression, right? They do not want us to have the time to learn, to think about other possibilities, or to feel how much they impact us, how much the daily toll of capitalism impacts our bodies, impacts our health and well-being. The inspiration from this podcast was thinking about when I was in my early recovery journey, and I was having a day where I was having a shame spiral. Like I was just like beating myself up. I was struggling to work that day. I just didn't have it in me. And that was terrifying because I had always grown up being so conditioned. I have to be perfect. I have to be perfect to survive this system. Experiencing that, and that first sense of like, oh my God, I'm not perfect. Like, what if I lose my job? Like, oh my God, what would happen if that were to happen? But there had been so much that had needed to be felt that I couldn't feel before because I had lived a life of moving at the pace of capitalism. I was trying to do the most. I was trying to be the most high achieving to try to combat the impact of racial capitalism and patriarchy that says that somebody like me, who is Afro-Indigenous, who is not a cis man, that somebody like me should not be able to survive in this system. So I was doing the most trying to combat that. And it impacted my health. All I could do to cope with that was alcohol. And I was so tense. I had such deep traumas from just like in my body. My body was all locked up. It was so tight. I had such tight muscles, tight shoulders, tight jaw. And that was not good for my health. It was not good for my health. And so many of us have chronic conditions, chronic illness because of this trauma, because of this ongoing stress that we are experiencing from these systems, because of the things that are not felt generation after generation that just keep rolling down the hill because nobody in our lineage has had the time or resource to feel. We need resource to feel. One of the big reasons that I was able to take time in early recovery to invest so deeply in my recovery is because I was working a really stable and well-paying job. So I had the capacity to go to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and recover. Again, I have problems with AA. I will talk about that in another episode. But to go to AA meetings, to pay therapists who had like a decolonial approach to therapy, to pay healers, to pay body workers, to go on retreats. I had that time and capital because of that job. There's so much talk in our generation around like we are the generational curse breakers, and that's what we are called to do. And for me, I know that a big part of like how I have been able to do that in my lineage is because I grew up more materially secure than any other people in my lineage since colonization. And again, different people may have come to it in different ways, but I know that to be true for my story because I have been more materially resourced, up until like my recovery journey. I was able to do that recovery journey and like be supported to get well. Things are different now in terms of finances, but that support was so crucial in terms of my well-being. And now I am financially struggling. There's such a big difference in terms of my well-being, in terms of my mental health. So we need to be well, we need to be supported in order to do this. We need to show our nervous systems that they have space to feel and to process. Because a lot of us, we come from lineages that they are in such deep survival mode. That's all they've ever known. And so, even if it's like, okay, you have resource, it can take the nervous system a long time to actually feel like, oh, I can slow down and I can breathe and I can heal. Like, what? Especially if that's been happening for generations. Again, that hustle, that grind. So it takes time, and it takes like showing our nervous systems that we can be safe, that we can be materially safe. And so it's safe enough to start to heal and to feel. There is so much relational trauma that also needs to be healed in our lineages. Patriarchy, colonial patriarchy was one of the biggest weapons of colonization. SA was a big weapon of colonization. And so for many of us in the relationships of our ancestors, there was non-consent. There were harms that were experienced because of like expectations of gender roles, of gender-based violence, of homophobia, of transphobia, and the ways that that has suppressed our ancestors from being who they are and trickling down to trying to make us feel like we cannot be who we are. There is compulsive monogamy and the ways that that has caused so much pain because instead of having conversations driven around consent, I come from the Caribbean, and so there is so much cheating. There is so much like non-consensual non-monogamy that happens in the Caribbean, because there is like this patriarchal norm and expectation that men can go around and sleep with whoever and that's fine. And that's often done without other people's consent, without other people being informed that that's happening. And that is terrifying and so deeply harmful, so deeply harmful that, you know, a lot of us who are like Caribbean, like there can be like this struggle around thinking about non-monogamy initially, because there's like this harm that has come, this boundary violation in terms of like communication and from these patriarchal expectations around what that could look like. And again, also the ways that the church plays into that, because the compulsive monogamy was also fueled by the church. It's like, you must be married, like that is the only right way to have sex, have relationships. So what that does in terms of stifling what our relationships can be and creating paradigms where anything else outside of that is wrong, and like you can't even have conversation about it, you can't even imagine something that could be more freeing and more consensual for everybody involved. Instead, we just have these patterns of patriarchy and consent violations and harm. Because of that, we have whole people who, you know, have never had their pleasure centered. You know, pleasure has not been a thing under patriarchy for people who are not like cishet men, because of these colonial wounds, and that not being prioritized, not being discussed, not being felt or healed from or supported. That pattern continues and goes across generations. And it would disrupt what have been the norms around patriarchy, around homophobia and transphobia, if we felt them, and if we felt where we could be even more free than what these systems have told us that we have to be for generations and generations. So what are the conditions that are needed in order for us to feel into freedom? We need resource. We need resource. I think about, it still burns in my mind. I think about how Kamala Harris raised $300 million in a single month. And that horrifies me, because I know that that money is not going to benefit our collective liberation. Like, Kamala has committed to continuing to enact mass unaliving in the land of the olive trees, and has not come out saying anything or much of anything that would really support the collective, not just in the US empire, but collectively. You know, of course not. All the president is somebody who will continue to enact like the empire, and who will continue to uphold capitalism. That is all that they will do. That is all that role is to keep up the colonial project of the United States. So we need resource. That resource could have been distributed for collective well-being, but we live in a society that greatly stigmatizes the idea of giving directly to each other. Instead, money gets like caught up in nonprofits that control how people receive support, how people receive well-being, how people receive like basic resources like housing and things. I think about the book Saving Our Own Lives by Shira Hassan, and in that book she talks about sobriety requirements as one of the things that really can keep people from the safe housing that they need to navigate and explore what they want their relationship to substances to look like. How are we supposed to walk a sobriety or harm reduction path or recovery path if we don't have housing, right? How is that supposed to be? Because I know somebody will be will probably be like, well, I did it, but it's so inaccessible for so many people, right? And recovery stories are often so individualistic. We don't think about how systemically inaccessible that is. But these nonprofits gatekeep who gets access to resource, and oftentimes it's not the community that really benefits. The community and how they receive resources so controlled by these nonprofits and by the government, which funds the nonprofits oftentimes, or by very rich people who define how the nonprofit should do things or who the nonprofit money gets to go to, instead of just contributing to each other's well-being directly, taking care of your neighbors. I think about a time that I was going hungry. It was a couple weeks ago. I was like hungry. I couldn't afford groceries. Bank was in overdraft. And my neighbor, unbeknownst to my neighbor, came down and gifted me like a loaf of bread that they had just been making and trying out. And that bread held me over in terms of food for 2 days. And they didn't know how much that meant to me. But for me, I was like, wow, like I am supported and held by community care. And I told them later just like how much that meant to me. I've had a friend who since then got me groceries because, again, knowing that like things have been financially shaky, gifted me those groceries. And that was so deeply impactful, like just knowing that I'm held. Investing in taking care of our neighbors, in taking care of our friends, our local community, making sure that they are emotionally, materially, financially well in order to keep healing, in order to keep having this space. I think about recovery and it's like, oh, one of my biggest dreams is like, what would it be like to do big mutual aid support as part of recovery support? How could we redistribute money so people could be well? And I think about all the people who heard that and are probably like, you're going to give like people who are struggling, like you're going to give those people money? We are so stigmatized against giving to unhoused people because there's this notion of like, oh, they're just going to use that for drugs. One, we don't get to determine what people use it for. If that gives them pleasure to survive another day, like great. And as we are trying to live and be, the funds to be able to live and be are so essential to our well-being. So thinking about, instead of giving to these big institutions that are not supporting our communities, giving directly to people. We have seen that a lot more with what's happening in the land of the olive trees. And so many of us have been giving directly to folks in the land of the olive trees. And as the time of I'm recording this, GoFundMe recently started to freeze access to funds for folks who are in the land of the olive trees, which is life threatening because those folks have been depending on us to directly get the support that they need to keep living, to have access to clean water and food and shelter. Shout out to the Shaheen family. I will like show a picture of them. You can sign up for their Chuffed, which me and the team of organizers, like we move them over to Chuffed. So that way this organization that is so willing to just go ahead and endanger the lives of folks in the lands of the olive trees don't continue to get our money. You're going to do that, no money for you. Seeking support from trusted healers. I need to talk a bit about the mental health industrial complex here and the way that the mental health field is deeply incentivized to not disrupt systems of oppression. Shout out to Dr. Jennifer Mullen of Decolonizing Therapy, where she talks about extensively in her book that the mental health field is deeply invested in us continuing to uphold these oppressive systems. The mental health field as it stands now is not going to provide the tools or affirmation in general that really what we are struggling with is not so much just like outsized anxiety or depression, but actually struggling with everything we've been talking about, right? Like the fact that my landlord is trying to raise my rent $200 a month, and that money is now the money that it is worth like a week's worth of groceries, and that our tax dollars are going to enact mass unaliving in the land of the olive trees. And we don't want that, but there are tons of industries that will benefit from that, the military industrial complex. So, let's keep sending your money over there, even though like that's the last thing that you want to be happening. So that makes sense. And we still every day are getting mass unaliving beamed through our phones. And we have a government that is actively co-signing and trying to get that to continue, right? Because there are so many who stand to profit from that. So that's horrifying. And it makes sense that we would be anxious about our survival. We would be feeling hopeless because this government has shown us that we should feel hopeless, or at least it wants us to feel that way, because it's like, ha, I will go in the face of everything that you would want, and I am actively ignoring all of your resistance movements and continuing this violence because I don't care about you. I only care about profit. So it makes sense to feel that way. But a lot of the mental health industry is not going to honor that. Instead, they're going to pathologize you and be like, wow, like, let's talk about compartmentalization. Yeah. Let's talk about that and prioritizing that. Or, have you ever just thought about having different thoughts? It leaves us feeling hopeless, and it can leave us really doubting what we have lived and have known, because these systems are just like, oh no, that is not what makes sense to respond to in this moment, or what makes sense to respond to as a collective, because we have talked extensively in this episode about the impacts of colonization, right? And that has not been felt or processed for 500 years for so many of us. Or, enacting, like, if we're settlers, like enacting violence and the ways of like being complacent to enacting colonial violence. And what does it look like to feel that? What does it look like to feel how much has been lost because you have bought into whiteness? I have a course called Unsettling Recovery where we take 6 months and we talk about that. So check that out if you want to learn more about that. But there is so much to be felt and processed that we have not. And instead, it stays stuck in us. It stays stuck in our bodies. We don't even have full access to our bodies because of this. So we need support that can help us to feel more human, to validate our humanity, to help us process what we are experiencing and what we are navigating in the now. And how do we navigate just how intense it is also when we look at all of this stuff? Because this is not easy. Whether it is what we are actively facing right now, again, at the time of recording this, it is 11 months into escalating mass unaliving in the land of the olive trees. How are we supposed to be with this intensity? How are we supposed to feel it? Harm reduction is a big way that we like process and feel it. Shout out to a mentor and friend of mine, a harm reductionist, who really emphasized again that like it is not sustainable to feel all of these things at once. It is just not for our like beautiful little bodies, like processing all of the things and all of the amount of information that we have access to in a given moment is not what we have like historically done or what we can really handle. And so harm reduction is so big. And whether that is harm reduction in terms of substances, right? So looking at a relationship to substances, for me personally, my harm reduction practice is to not consume substances, like mind altering substances, because I have seen that to be like a greater harm to myself than to indulge in substances. And that's just on that for me. But for you, it might be navigating a relationship to substances and seeing like, where are they giving you pleasure? Where are they maybe inhibiting some access to being present? Or maybe where are they causing harm in certain aspects of your relationships or to your health? And that's something to sit with as you sit with how potentially substances might help you navigate this moment, or choosing to walk away from substances might help you navigate this moment. Part of how I do harm reduction then, as somebody who doesn't lean on mind altering substances, and it's like, saying that is so interesting, right? Because I love sugar. I love sugar. I love food. I love chocolate. Chocolate is one of those things that is talked about trauma healing community. The idea of glimmers, these things that like give us a glimmer, a glimpse, a moment of joy, of pleasure. And chocolate is one of those things for me. So, food, sugar, chocolate, it is something that like creates that spark of joy in that given moment. I'm also a nerd. And from a young age, I have learned that part of how I can navigate survival of these systems is through TV, through anime, through video games, books. But let's be real, I'm part of that phenomenon of adults who like read a lot and now are just like, show me colors on TV, you know? But being able to escape this world for a bit through this form of media can be helpful in terms of like tuning down our nervous system. I think about in the fall of 2023, in the beginning of the escalation of the mass unaliving, I got put on by my like good friend to this show called Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. And that show deals with a lot of the similar themes around mass unaliving that we have been seeing in the land of the olive trees. And so my nervous system was in such a place of like, I cannot look away. I cannot disengage. Like, I cannot do this. I must stay in tune because everything is trying to get me to not, right? So that was where my nervous system was in October 2023, November 2023. And so this show was, it was kind of like the only refuge in terms of like trying to fall asleep at night, because it was the same themes, the same intensity around mass unaliving and grief, but it was in a different world and there was a resolution to that. And so it was a slight departure where I could like get involved in this different world with different rules and disengage for a little bit so I could go to sleep. So that way in the morning, I could do my best to combat what was happening in terms of like the mass unaliving in our planet, in our realm, right? Whether that was a protest, whether that was speaking out online, whether that was speaking to Zionists and combating that, having that little bit of harm reduction space did that. Another big way that we can support each other in being present in this moment is supporting each other, having conversation with other folks who get it, right? Or just even the presence of like a phone call with somebody who you know it is like safe to talk to, being able to meet up with somebody in person and go on a walk, and just the way that that helps our nervous system come down, knowing that we are not alone and that we can connect and co-regulate together. Like that is so healing and so helpful in navigating the intensity of these times, especially somebody who gets it. Because when not, we can be left to doubt ourselves if we're around people who are not holding that reality, not recognizing just how intense systems of oppression and colonization, mass unaliving is happening. It can feel worse sometimes to connect with somebody who is like not living in that reality, because it makes us, these systems are so invested in making us doubt our reality that it's just like we need people that we know we can go to and that it's like safe to do so. And it's interesting thinking about like finding people who are safe, because it is also a journey for our nervous systems to identify what safety looks like. I think about being in early recovery, and I grew up in predominantly white Italian, Irish, Catholic neighborhood. And that's what I knew. Like, that's what had been familiar my whole life. And so in early recovery, gravitating towards therapists, gravitating towards like mentors who came from those backgrounds that I knew. And I thought, oh, that's safe. That's what I know, right? Like, that's safe. And actually, in recovery, I needed support to heal from that background, to heal from growing up in predominantly white spaces and the ways that I had been suppressed and suppressed myself in order to survive those systems. So it was a whole journey to eventually come to, the decolonizing support connected to my like African indigenous like lineages, support from practitioners who are like invested in recovering the ancestral traditions that have been lost and who are deeply invested in collective liberation, queer and trans people who are moving in a politically queer and trans way, has been what I need for a sense of safety when I'm receiving care oftentimes. And so just noticing that for you and your journey, like what are the kind of requirements for safety? And also noting that if you are early on in your journey of healing, of recovering, of feeling, it might take some time to figure out what is actually safe and supportive for you. And also give yourself grace if that's not accessible, because the supports that we need sometimes are not accessible, and sometimes we have to make concessions, and that can be a grief too. We started with me talking about how when we feel we are a threat to systems of oppression, and I don't think there's a louder example of that than thinking about the big movements that we have navigated in the past 4 years. Thinking about between George Floyd and the uprisings for the movement for Black Lives in 2020 and the mobilization for the mass unaliving escalation that has been happening in the land of the olive trees. That is because so many of us tapped into our grief, our rage, and just feeling the deep injustice from systemic oppression, from colonization, from imperialism. That especially has been really, really loud to notice in everything that has been happening in the past 11 months here with what's happening in the land of the olive trees. We felt that our humanity felt so connected to what's been happening that we took to the streets, that we took to boycotting organizations and institutions affiliated with this mass unaliving. And to the point where Is Not Real's economy has been struggling because of the boycotts. The big institutions like McDonald's, like Starbucks, are financially struggling because of the boycotts that are happening. So feeling deeply what has been happening is the stuff of revolution. I think about Kenya and its like revolution and pushing against its government that wanted to enact colonization all over again and extract more resource from their people, and the people of Kenya saying like, enough, I will not feel that anymore, I will not let this continue to happen. The same thing for young people in Bangladesh who pushed against their government that was trying to unfairly like distribute jobs in a way that would leave so many people unwell. We're not having that, we're fighting back. So when we feel just how much pain these systems have put us under, we fight back. And when we choose not to, or we choose to try to prioritize surviving capitalism, or, there's so many people who like will profit from the mass unaliving in the land of the olive trees. Like they just can't wait to get their beachfront properties sitting on like oil resource and like trade routes. Like, oh, they can't wait. When we choose to detach from our humanity and instead prioritize surviving under capitalism or trying to exploit under capitalism, that's when we act in a way that goes against our humanity. That's when we are on the wrong side of history, when we choose to live in not feeling our interconnectedness with every human, every being on this planet, and instead choose to prioritize surviving these systems. That's when we stay complacent in these systems saying the same. We have to feel just how deeply these systems are currently impacting our planet and trying to keep us from being free. And we have to feel how deeply we are connected with all of us, all beings on this planet, in order to fight back. So, if you like this, I invite you to subscribe, to support us on Patreon to help support and sustain this podcast. I invite you to subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/recovery for the revolution, to help sustain this podcast and its well-being, and to help bring on other folks who can bring in beautiful insights in terms of how we are in a recovery, healing, revolutionary practice. I invite you to comment, let me know what you thought about this episode, what you want me to talk about next, and to share this with somebody that you know would benefit, because like we said over and over in this episode, capitalism wants us to feel isolated by design. So if you want to disrupt capitalism, start to have conversations about how we fight back. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.